Bikers kick an old man's truck until Steven Seagal makes them eat asphalt. A gang of leather-clad bikers surrounds a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran at a desert truck stop, kicking his pickup and shoving the Purple Heart winner to the ground. The motorcycle thugs laugh as they terrorize the elderly soldier, demanding he crawl and beg for mercy. But the ponytailed trucker stepping out of that massive Peterbilt isn't just another driver. This is Steven Seagal himself. The bikers have no idea they just assaulted a war hero in front of a man who's spent decades breaking bones with ancient martial arts. While the gang leader threatens to beat the old veteran senseless, the aikido master approaches with that deadly calm that made him a legend. The Purple Heart winner recognizes his savior and steps back, knowing these punks are about to learn why some warriors never retire. The bikers keep revving their engines, thinking they control this parking lot, but they're actually moments away from the beating of their lives. What happens when 12 bikers pick the wrong fight with the wrong trucker? Will the gang leader survive learning why legends never fade? What happened next would terrorize the thugs for the rest of their pathetic lives. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly in all directions, painted in shades of amber and rust as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Mile marker 47 on Interstate 40 marked nothing but empty highway and sagebrush, except for the weathered sign announcing Dusty's truck stop, last gas 50 miles. Frank Kowalski's 1987 Chevy Silverado crunched across the gravel parking lot, its engine ticking as it cooled. The truck bore the scars of decades of honest work: dented fenders, faded paint, and a spiderweb crack across the windshield that Frank had been meaning to fix for 3 years. More important were the details that mattered: POWMIA stickers on the rear window, Purple Heart license plates that had earned their place through blood and sacrifice. At T-72, Frank moved with the careful precision of a man whose body remembered wars his mind preferred to forget. Shrapnel fragments in his left leg made mornings stiff, but he still carried himself with the bearing of a soldier. His gray hair was cut military short, his weathered hands bore the calluses of honest labor, and his brown eyes remained sharp. Despite everything they'd seen, the truck stop's diner glowed warm against the desert chill. Inside, Dolores Martinez had been serving coffee and conversation to truckers for 15 years. She knew the regulars by their orders and their stories. "Morning, Frank," she called as the bell above the door announced his arrival. "Black coffee, no sugar." "You know me too well, Dolores." Frank's voice carried the gravelly warmth of a man who chose his words carefully. He slid into his usual booth by the window. The vinyl cracked but comfortable. As Dolores poured his coffee, Frank checked his watch. 5:47 a.m. Right on schedule. The drive to Pine Ridge Reservation would take 4 hours if he maintained speed and didn't hit construction. The cargo in his truck bed was precious: school supplies, medical equipment, and books for the reservation's children. Helen would have wanted him to be punctual. 2 years since cancer had taken his wife, and Frank still felt her presence strongest during these supply runs. Helen had taught at Pine Ridge for 30 years, touching countless young lives with her patience and wisdom. These monthly deliveries were Frank's way of keeping her memory alive, continuing the work that had meant everything to her. He sipped his coffee and watched the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold. The morning was peaceful, perfect for the long drive ahead. In the distance, something dark moved against the brightening sky. Motorcycles, still too far to hear, but growing larger on the empty highway. The rumble started as a whisper on the wind, then grew into a mechanical thunder that shattered the morning's peace. 12 Harley-Davidsons roared into Dusty's parking lot in precise formation, their chrome gleaming like weapons in the early sunlight. Viper McReady led the pack, his machine a black and silver monster that announced his status as president of the Death's Head Motorcycle Club. At 35, Viper carried himself with the swaggering confidence of a man who'd never met a fight he couldn't win. Prison tattoos covered his arms: teardrops, skulls, and the complex symbols that marked him as a lifetime member of a very exclusive and violent brotherhood. Behind him rode 11 other members, their leather cuts bearing the club's distinctive skull logo and Arizona territory patches that claimed ownership of everything they could take and hold. Snake Morrison revved his engine unnecessarily, grinning at the noise. Razor Collins spat tobacco juice onto the clean gravel. These were men who took pleasure in other people's discomfort. They parked with deliberate arrogance, taking up multiple spaces and leaving their bikes running just long enough to announce their presence to everyone within a mile radius. The formation was tactical, blocking escape routes and establishing dominance through sheer intimidation. Inside the diner, the temperature seemed to drop as the Death's Head MC made their entrance. They moved like a pack, shoulders touching, boots stomping, leather creaking with every step. Viper surveyed the room with cold gray eyes, cataloging potential threats and targets. The other customers felt it immediately. A young family with two small children quickly paid their bill and headed for the door, the father's hand protective on his wife's shoulder. An elderly couple from Minnesota abandoned their half-eaten breakfast and shuffled out, avoiding eye contact. "Coffee all around, sweetheart," Viper announced to Dolores, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "And make it fresh. We don't drink yesterday's swill." The bikers spread out across the diner, claiming booths and counter stools with the casual entitlement of an occupying army. Their conversation was deliberately loud. Crude jokes, crude observations, crude commentary on everything and everyone around them. Snake Morrison noticed Frank first, his attention drawn to the military bearing and the purple heart plates visible through the window. "Look what we got here," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Another one of them old war heroes." Viper followed Snake's gaze and smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. Through the window, Frank sat quietly in his booth, minding his own business and bothering no one, which, to Viper's way of thinking, made him perfect. Frank finished his coffee with deliberate calm, watching the bikers through the reflection in the window. 37 years of civilian life hadn't erased the tactical awareness drilled into him during 2 tours in Vietnam. He could count enemies, catalog weapons, and assess threats without appearing to pay attention. 12 of them, all younger, stronger, and looking for trouble. The smart play was to pay his bill, walk to his truck, and drive away. Let them have their moment of dominance over an empty diner. But as Frank stood and placed a $5 bill on the table, 3 times what the coffee cost, he felt Helen's memory sitting beside him. She'd never walked away from a bully in her life, never let intimidation change her course. Neither would he. The bell above the door chimed as Frank stepped into the cool morning air. Behind him, the bikers' conversation stopped. He could feel their attention like a weight on his shoulders as he walked steadily toward his truck, keys jingling softly in his weathered hand. "Hey, old man." Snake Morrison's voice cracked like a whip across the parking lot. Frank didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the challenge. He'd learned long ago that some fights came whether you wanted them or not. The sound was sharp and metallic, Snake's steel-toed boot connecting with the passenger door of Frank's truck. The impact left a significant dent in the faded blue paint and sent a shock of rage through Frank's chest that had nothing to do with property damage and everything to do with respect. "Your rust bucket's blocking our view." Snake's laugh was ugly, designed to humiliate and provoke. Frank stopped walking. Slowly, with the careful precision of a man who'd faced death before, he turned to face his tormentors. 11 more bikers had emerged from the diner, forming a loose semicircle that blocked any retreat to his truck. "Son," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd led men in combat. "That's my truck. I'd appreciate it if you'd keep your boots to yourself." Viper stepped forward, close enough that Frank could smell the stale beer and cigarettes on his breath. "What are you going to do about it, Grandpa?" "Call the cops." The biker's chest bumped against Frank's. A playground dominance move magnified by the threat of overwhelming violence. Frank didn't step back. Couldn't step back. Helen had taught children for 30 years, and every one of them had learned the same lesson. You don't reward bullies with surrender. "I'm asking you polite," Frank repeated, his hands relaxed at his sides. "Don't push this." Viper's laugh was genuinely amused. "Push what?" "This." The shove came hard and unexpected, Viper's hand striking Frank's chest with enough force to send the older man stumbling backward. Frank's bad leg betrayed him, and he windmilled his arms for balance before catching himself against his truck's tailgate. The bikers laughed and moved closer, smelling victory and blood. Frank straightened slowly, his military bearing intact despite the humiliation. He was outnumbered 12-1, but he'd been in worse odds before. Then a voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Gentlemen." The voice carried absolute authority despite its quiet tone, causing every head in the parking lot to turn. From the shadows between two massive 18-wheelers, a figure emerged with the fluid grace of a predator who'd been watching and waiting. Steven Seagal stepped into the morning sunlight, and everything about the confrontation changed in an instant. At 73, he remained an imposing figure, 6 feet 4 inches of weathered strength, long black hair streaked with silver and pulled back in a traditional ponytail. His face bore the lines of experience, but his dark eyes held the calm intensity of a man who'd spent decades mastering the art of controlled violence. He wore simple work clothes, faded jeans, a flannel shirt with rolled sleeves, and steel-toed boots that had covered thousands of highway miles. Nothing flashy, nothing that announced danger to casual observers. But the way he moved, the perfect balance and awareness in every step, marked him as something far beyond an ordinary truck driver. The Death's Head MC members instinctively reassessed their situation. Viper had built his reputation on reading people, on knowing when someone was prey and when they might be predator. The stranger approaching them moved like a man who'd never been prey in his life. "Is there a problem here?" Seagal asked, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had stopped the confrontation cold. He positioned himself casually, hands relaxed at his sides, but Frank's combat experience recognized the stance immediately. Perfect fighting posture disguised as non-threatening presence. Viper forced a sneer, unwilling to show weakness in front of his crew. "Mind your own business, ponytail. Unless you want some too." Seagal's gaze moved slowly across the scene, taking in Frank's military bearing, the damaged truck, and the circle of bikers who clearly outnumbered their victims. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a recognition of injustice that demanded correction. "I see an older gentleman being hassled by a dozen men who should know better," Seagal replied evenly. "That makes it my business." "Snake." Morrison stepped forward, emboldened by numbers and eager to impress his president. "You picked the wrong fight, old man. We eat truckers like you for breakfast." Seagal studied Snake with the calm assessment of a professional evaluating an amateur. "I don't think you understand the situation." Frank watched from beside his truck, recognizing something in the stranger's bearing that spoke of shared experience. The quiet confidence of someone who'd faced violence and emerged victorious. More than that, something about the man's face seemed familiar, like a half-remembered movie poster or television appearance. Viper decided to reassert control before his crew started thinking the stranger might actually be dangerous. "The only thing I understand is that you got about 5 seconds to walk away before we teach you some manners." Seagal looked directly at Frank, then at the damaged truck door, then back at Viper. His expression remained perfectly calm, but Frank caught the slight tightening around his eyes that preceded action. "I think you owe this gentleman an apology," Seagal said quietly. Viper's laugh was harsh and ugly. "The only thing I owe anybody is a beating." Viper's haymaker came fast and brutal, the kind of punch that had ended fights in prison yards and bar rooms across 3 states. It never connected. Steven Seagal moved like water flowing around stone, deflecting the punch with an aikido technique that redirected Viper's momentum into empty air. In the same fluid motion, he captured the biker's wrist and shoulder, using Viper's own force to send him flying across the parking lot. The club president crashed into his pristine Harley with bone-crushing impact, chrome and leather meeting flesh and bone in a symphony of destruction. The other bikers froze for a heartbeat, their minds struggling to process what they'd witnessed. Their leader, the man who'd beaten cops unconscious and left rival gang members in intensive care, had just been tossed like a child's toy. Snake Morrison recovered first, yanking a switchblade from his boot with practiced violence. "You're dead, old man." The knife thrust aimed for Seagal's ribs never found its target. Seagal's hand intercepted Snake's wrist with surgical precision, applying pressure to nerve points that sent screaming agony up the biker's arm. The audible snap of breaking bone echoed across the parking lot as the knife clattered harmlessly to the gravel. Seagal's follow-up elbow strike to Snake's solar plexus dropped him like a stone, gasping and retching in the dirt. Razor Collins attempted a tackle, 300 pounds of muscle and momentum aimed at the stranger's midsection. Seagal sidestepped with minimal effort, using the biker's own force to redirect him face-first into the gravel. Razor's nose exploded in a fountain of blood as he plowed furrows in the parking lot. Bruiser Kane produced a chain from his jacket, swinging it like a medieval flail. Seagal caught the chain mid-swing, his grip like iron, and yanked Bruiser off balance. The same chain that was meant to crush bone became a weapon of justice as Seagal used it to clothesline two more advancing bikers. In 30 seconds, 6 members of the Death's Head MC lay groaning in various states of consciousness and injury. The remaining bikers backed away, their swagger replaced by something approaching genuine fear. Seagal stood among the carnage, breathing normally, his flannel shirt not even wrinkled. He looked at the conscious bikers with the same calm expression he'd worn throughout the encounter. "I believe you had something to say to this gentleman." The remaining Death's Head members mumbled apologies that sounded more like barely contained threats, but Frank heard genuine fear beneath their bravado. They helped their injured brothers to their feet, loading the unconscious ones onto motorcycles like sacks of grain. Viper struggled upright, his nose streaming blood and his leather cut torn from shoulder to hip. Hatred burned in his gray eyes as he glared at Seagal, but survival instinct overrode his desire for immediate revenge. "This ain't over," he snarled, spitting blood onto the gravel. Nobody embarrasses the Death's Head and walks away. Seagal met his stare with perfect calm. "I'll be right here if you want to continue the conversation." The bikers retreated to their machines, engines roaring to life in a cacophony of defiance and defeat. They peeled out of the parking lot in formation, but their rigid discipline had cracked. Frank watched them disappear down Interstate 40, knowing with absolute certainty they'd be back. "Much obliged, friend." Frank extended his weathered hand to his rescuer. Frank Kowalski, 1st Cavalry Division, Vietnam. The stranger's handshake was firm but gentle, the grip of someone who knew his own strength. "Steven Seagal." Frank's eyes widened in recognition. The face had aged, the hair had silvered, but there was no mistaking the man who dominated action. Movies throughout the 90s. "Well, I'll be damned. Never expected to meet you working as a trucker." "Life takes unexpected turns," Seagal replied with a slight smile. "Sometimes the road teaches you more than Hollywood ever could." Inside the diner, Dolores refused payment for fresh coffee, her hands shaking as she poured. "Thank you," she whispered repeatedly. They've been getting worse every month, but nobody ever stood up to them. Frank found himself opening up to this unlikely savior, sharing details he rarely spoke about. Helen's death 2 years ago, the cancer that took her despite 30 years of service to Pine Ridge children, the guilt of a soldier who'd survived wars but couldn't save his wife from disease. "These supply runs help me feel connected to her memory," Frank explained, gesturing toward his loaded truck. "Medical equipment, school supplies, books for the kids. Helen always said education was the best weapon against poverty." Seagal nodded thoughtfully. "Pine Ridge. I'm heading that direction myself. Construction materials for a new community center." He studied Frank's face, reading the loneliness there. "Mind if I ride along? Those boys might decide to regroup." Frank's relief was visible. The desert highway suddenly seemed less lonely. The 2 trucks rolled onto Interstate 40 in convoy formation, Frank's battle-scarred Silverado leading while Seagal's massive Peterbilt followed like a protective shadow. The CB radio crackled too. Life as they established communication on Channel 19. "Breaker 19, this is Desert Eagle." Seagal's voice carried clearly through the static. "You copy, Blue Thunder?" Frank smiled despite everything. He hadn't used a CB handle in decades. "Copy loud and clear, Desert Eagle." Blue Thunder rolling steady. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, 2 ribbons of asphalt cutting through landscape that changed from desert scrub to red rock formations. As miles passed beneath their wheels, conversation flowed as naturally as the pavement rolling by. Frank found himself sharing memories he'd kept locked away since Helen's funeral. The guilt that ate at him during quiet moments, how he'd survived rocket attacks and sniper fire in Vietnam, but felt helpless watching cancer destroy the woman he loved. The way these monthly supply runs had become his lifeline, connecting him to Helen's legacy and giving purpose to days that otherwise felt empty. "She taught for 30 years at Pine Ridge," Frank's voice carried a mixture of pride and pain. Kids would come back as adults just to thank her. Some became teachers themselves, doctors, lawyers. Helen used to say every child was a seed that just needed the right soil to grow. Seagal shared his own journey from Hollywood fame to spiritual seeking. The emptiness he'd felt despite success, the way movie sets had become prisons of artifice and ego. How he'd walked away from million-dollar contracts to find something real, something that mattered beyond box office receipts. Found more truth in 2 years on these highways than 20 years in boardrooms, Seagal admitted. Trucking strips away the pretense. You're judged by your actions, not your reputation. Their conversation was interrupted by chatter from other truckers on the CB. Reports of motorcycle activity up ahead, groups of bikers spread across multiple truck stops and rest areas, apparently coordinating through cell phones rather than radio. Sounds like they're organizing, Frank observed, checking his mirrors. Seagal switched to a secure channel. Frank, we might have company. These boys seem to have friends. The peaceful camaraderie of the highway suddenly felt fragile, threatened by the promise of violence ahead. 20 miles behind them, Viper McReady sat in a roadside dive called Lucky's Bar, pressing a bag of frozen peas against his swollen nose. While making the most important phone call of his criminal career, blood had dried on his leather cut, and every breath reminded him of cracked ribs, but his humiliation burned hotter than physical pain. Sheriff Bradley? It's Viper. We got a problem. Sheriff Dixon Bradley answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the casual corruption of a man who'd been bought and paid for years ago. At 52, Bradley had built his political career on Death's Head MC money, winning elections through voter intimidation and campaign contributions laundered through legitimate businesses. What kind of problem? Bradley's office overlooked the county courthouse, but his real business was conducted in shadows. Viper explained the morning's events through gritted teeth, his pride forcing him to minimize the scope of his defeat. But Bradley understood the implications immediately. Frank Kowalski's regular supply runs had been interfering with their smuggling operations for months, and now he had dangerous protection. The sheriff's criminal network stretched across 3 states, using reservation land for drug trafficking. Because federal jurisdiction complications made law enforcement response slow and ineffective. The Death's Head MC provided muscle and transportation, while Bradley's badge provided legal cover for their operations. Kowalski's been a thorn in our side long enough, Bradley said, already calculating his response. And this Steven Seagal, real or fake, just became a threat to a multi-million-dollar operation. He immediately mobilized his 2 most corrupt deputies, Jimmy Carson and Rick Sandoval, both men whose loyalty had been purchased through a combination of bribes and blackmail. Their orders were simple: intercept the convoy under false pretenses and eliminate the threat. Make it look legitimate, Bradley instructed. Traffic stop, resisting arrest, weapons found during search. You know the drill. As Frank and Seagal drove through increasingly desolate country, police sirens began wailing behind them. 2 sheriff's department cruisers approached at high speed, emergency lights flashing, but their aggressive formation suggested something far more sinister than routine law enforcement. The radio chatter Seagal intercepted confirmed his worst suspicions, coded references to merchandise, cleaning up loose ends, and permanent solutions that had nothing to do with legitimate police work. Frank, Seagal's voice carried deadly certainty over the CB. When I say go, floor it. Deputies Jimmy Carson and Rick Sandoval approached the convoy with weapons drawn, their aggressive tactics immediately alerting Seagal's trained instincts. Legitimate police officers would have called for backup before confronting potentially dangerous suspects. These men moved like predators closing in on prey. Driver, exit the vehicle with your hands visible. Carson's shout carried false authority, his service weapon aimed directly at Frank's head through the windshield. Seagal's CB crackled with urgent whispers. Frank, these aren't real cops. Real officers don't approach like this without backup. Through his mirrors, Seagal watched Sandoval circle toward the passenger side of Frank's truck while Carson kept his weapon trained on the elderly veteran. Their radio chatter included coded phrases about merchandise and cleaning up problems, language no legitimate officer would use during a traffic stop. Carson raised his nightstick to smash Frank's window, and Seagal made his tactical decision. Go. The massive Peterbilt lurched forward like a mechanical avalanche, its reinforced bumper catching Carson's patrol car in the rear quarter panel. The cruiser spun violently before rolling off the highway in a cascade of sparks and twisted metal. Carson dove clear, his weapon skittering across asphalt as he tumbled into roadside gravel. Frank's Silverado shot forward, engine screaming as he pushed the old truck beyond its normal limits. Behind him, Sandoval scrambled to his feet, radioing frantically for assistance while pursuing the fleeing convoy. Seagal used his truck's superior weight and power like a weapon, forcing Sandoval's patrol car toward the highway's edge whenever the deputy tried to close distance. The mountain road's narrow lanes and steep drops provided natural barriers that favored defensive driving over pursuit. More sirens approached from multiple directions, Bradley's corrupt network mobilizing. In force, radio chatter revealed at least 4 additional units converging on their position, all using the same coded language that marked them as criminals wearing badges. The high-speed chase wound through Arizona backcountry, patrol cars joining and falling away as Seagal systematically disabled them through superior driving and tactical thinking. But their radiators were overheating from the mountain climb, and fuel gauges dropped toward empty. Seagal guided them toward an abandoned mining town he'd scouted months earlier, Ghost Mountain, a place that could be defended if escape became impossible. Ghost Mountain appeared through desert haze like a mirage of salvation, its weathered buildings and rusted mining equipment offering shelter from the pursuing storm of corrupt badges and screaming sirens. Seagal led Frank's overheating Silverado between abandoned structures, their trucks finally gasping to a stop behind the old mining office. The building was solid stone construction, built to withstand desert storms and time itself. Thick walls provided cover from small arms fire, while limited entrances could be defended by determined fighters. Seagal had memorized the layout months ago during his cross-country travels, filing away defensive positions like a chess master studying the board. Frank grabbed his service pistol from beneath the truck's seat, a Colt .45 he'd carried since Vietnam, while Seagal retrieved a tactical bag from his sleeper cab. They took refuge inside the mining office, catching their breath while sirens wailed in the distance. "How many you figure?" Frank asked, checking his weapon's action with practiced efficiency. "At least 8 vehicles, maybe more," Seagal replied, studying approach routes through grimy windows. "They'll surround us before moving in." As they explored their defensive position, Frank noticed details that didn't belong in a truly abandoned location. Fresh tire tracks pressed into dust that should have been undisturbed for decades. Cigarette butts that hadn't weathered through multiple seasons. Food wrappers bearing recent manufacturing dates. "Someone's been using this place," Frank observed, his combat instincts sharpening. Seagal nodded grimly. "Recently and regularly." Their investigation led deeper into the mining complex, following a trail of evidence that grew more disturbing with each discovery. The old mine shafts showed signs of recent excavation and reinforcement. Generator cables snaked between buildings, providing power where none should exist. Then they found the first chain. Heavy steel links bolted to stone walls, with enough length to allow movement but prevent escape. Stained mattresses arranged in rows like prison cells. Personal items scattered. Across the floor, jewelry, clothing, photographs of young women with hopeful smiles. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, his military experience providing context for horrors he'd hoped never to see again. The abandoned mine wasn't abandoned at all. It was a holding facility, a way station in some larger operation that trafficked in human misery. The evidence spoke of systematic cruelty, of innocents imprisoned in darkness while predators profited from their suffering. Seagal's jaw tightened as understanding dawned. "We've stumbled into something bigger than corrupt cops." Outside, the sirens had stopped. In the sudden silence, they could hear boots on gravel and the metallic clicks of weapons being readied. "Federal agent, lower your weapons." The voice belonged to a young woman who emerged from the mine shaft's shadows with her service pistol drawn but not aimed. Maria Clearwater moved with the controlled aggression of someone trained to face danger, her dark eyes scanning for threats, while assessing the 2 men who'd stumbled into her surveillance operation. "Tribal police," she corrected, showing her badge. "Officer Maria Clearwater, Pine Ridge Law Enforcement." At 28, Maria carried herself with authority that commanded respect despite her youth. Her long black hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her athletic build spoke of someone who stayed ready for physical confrontation. Intelligence burned in her eyes, the sharp awareness of a detective who'd been gathering evidence for weeks. 3 young women have disappeared from Pine Ridge in the last 2 months, Maria explained, holstering her weapon as she recognized Frank and Seagal as allies rather than enemies. Iona Standing Bear, 17. Jennifer Crow Feather, 19. Sarah Little Wolf, 22. All vanished without a trace. She led them deeper into the mine complex, revealing the scope of her unauthorized investigation. Hidden cameras positioned to document trafficker activities. Audio recording equipment capturing conversations between corrupt officials. Evidence bags containing DNA samples and personal effects that could convict the entire network. The operation's bigger than anyone realized, Maria continued. Death's Head Motorcycle Club kidnaps Native American women from reservations across the Southwest. They hold them here temporarily before transporting them to cities for prostitution. The girls are specifically targeted because missing Native women get less media attention and fewer resources for investigation. Frank's face darkened with understanding. My supply runs brought attention to their routes. Exactly. Your regular schedule interfered with their transportation timing. Sheriff Bradley provides legal cover, making sure investigations get misdirected or buried entirely. But there's someone above him, a businessman named Caldwell Brass who finances the operation and provides political protection. Seagal studied the evidence Maria had gathered. How long have you been working this alone? 6 weeks. I couldn't trust anyone in law enforcement. The corruption runs too deep. Federal agents are 3 days out, but these girls don't have 3 days. Radio chatter outside revealed their worst fears. 15 deaths, head MC members, were en route, along with Sheriff Bradley himself and someone the corrupt deputies referred to respectfully as Mr. Brass. More than 40 armed men were converging on Ghost Mountain. We're outnumbered 10 to 1. Frank observed with military pragmatism that Maria's expression hardened with determination. Then we better make every shot count. Maria led them to the mine shaft where 6 young women were currently imprisoned, Native American girls aged 17 to 22, all showing signs of prolonged captivity but mercifully still alive. Their eyes reflected the hollow trauma of victims who'd abandoned hope, but spark remained beneath the fear. We're here to get you out, Maria whispered in Lakota, then English. These men are going to help. The rescue seemed almost too straightforward, as they cut chains and helped weakened prisoners toward the mine entrance. Frank's combat engineering experience identified structural weak points that could be exploited for escape routes, while Seagal's tactical knowledge mapped defensive positions. Throughout the complex, but Seagal's instincts screamed warnings that experience had taught him never to ignore. The approaching sirens had stopped too suddenly. The radio chatter had become too organized. Most telling, the mine shaft's main entrance showed signs of recent explosive preparation, charges placed with military precision. It's a trap, he announced, just as the explosions began. The entrance collapsed in a cascade of stone and timber, sealing them underground with the very victims they'd come to save. Emergency lighting flickered on, revealing the cold efficiency of a plan designed by someone with professional military experience. Steven Seagal. The voice echoed through hidden speakers with cultured authority. Your reputation precedes you. Unfortunately for you, so does your predictability. Colonel Jack Rourke's voice carried the clipped precision of a career soldier turned criminal entrepreneur. Former special forces, dishonorably discharged for war crimes, now selling his tactical expertise to the highest bidder. He'd positioned over 40 men throughout the mining complex, turning their rescue attempt into a killing ground. You walked into my operational theater, Rourke continued as smoke began filtering through ventilation shafts. Thermal imaging tracked your every movement. Motion sensors cataloged your positions. You're trapped in a cave with limited oxygen and no escape routes. Incendiary devices dropped through ventilation shafts, filling the mine with choking smoke. The temperature rose as oxygen levels dropped. 6 terrified victims huddled against stone walls while their would-be rescuers faced the reality of professional military opposition. Frank checked his ammunition, 2 magazines for his .45. Maria? had her service weapon and one spare clip. Seagal's tactical bag contained equipment for situations exactly like this. But against 40 armed enemies in prepared positions, even superior skills had limitations. Frank, Seagal's voice carried deadly calm despite their circumstances. Remember what you learned about tunnel fighting in Vietnam. Outside, Colonel Rourke smiled as he watched thermal readings on his tactical display. The trap had worked perfectly. Smoke filled the mine shaft like poison fog. But Frank's Vietnam experience kicked in with muscle memory honed in Siu Chi tunnels 45 years earlier. There, he pointed to a barely visible opening in the rock wall, connecting shaft. They always dug multiple escape routes. Seagal took point, his tactical bag producing emergency lighting and breathing filters. The 6 rescued women moved with desperate cooperation, understanding that survival depended on following orders without question. Maria brought up the rear, her service weapon ready for pursuit that would inevitably come. The connecting tunnel was a nightmare of loose rock and unstable timbers, barely wide enough for single-file movement. Water dripped constantly, and the air tasted of minerals and decades-old decay. But it led away from Rourke's killing ground toward hope of escape that Frank's combat engineering expertise proved invaluable as they encountered the first booby trap. A tripwire connected to mining explosives that would have collapsed the tunnel on top of them. His steady hands disarmed the device while explaining the mechanism to Seagal in whispered technical detail. "Works good," Frank admitted, sweat beading on his forehead despite the underground chill. "Professional placement, military-grade materials." But he's thinking like a soldier, not a tunnel rat. They moved through the labyrinthine mine complex like ghosts, following routes that predated Rourke's tactical preparation. Frank identified 3 more booby traps, each one disarmed with the precision of someone who'd learned these skills under fire in Southeast Asian jungles. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer, boots on stone, radio chatter echoing through. Connecting passages, the systematic search pattern of professional soldiers who understood underground warfare. Rourke's mercenaries were experienced, but they were following established tactical doctrine. Frank led them through forgotten maintenance shafts and abandoned or chutes, his memory of similar tunnel systems guiding their escape. The rescued women showed remarkable endurance despite their ordeal, drawing strength from the possibility of freedom. 2 hours after entering the mine, they emerged through a concealed entrance 2 miles from Ghost Mountain, gasping desert air like drowning swimmers breaking the surface. But their vehicles were destroyed, they were on foot in hostile territory, and radio intercepts revealed that Caldwell Brass himself was en route with additional private security forces. "We're not safe yet," Seagal observed, scanning the horizon. "For pursuit, this is just the beginning." The desert trek became a grueling test of endurance as Frank led their group across trackless wasteland toward Pine Ridge Reservation. The 6 rescued women, weakened by captivity, struggled with each mile despite Maria's constant encouragement in both English and Lakota. Seagal used advanced tracking techniques to obscure their trail, but experienced pursuers would eventually follow. Frank's military discipline kept the group organized and moving despite exhaustion. He rationed their limited water supplies, chose routes that provided natural concealment, and maintained tactical awareness even while helping traumatized victims navigate difficult terrain. After 12 hours of hiking through desert that tested everyone's limits, they reached the reservation boundary where Chief Thomas Eaglefeather waited with vehicles and medical personnel. The 78-year-old tribal leader embraced Frank like the old friend he was, their relationship forged through decades of Helen's educational work. "Frank, what have you brought to our doorstep?" Chief Eaglefeather's weathered face showed concern mixed with determination to protect anyone seeking sanctuary on tribal land. The reservation's medical facility, though small, provided immediate care for the rescued women. Trauma counselors began the delicate work of helping victims process their ordeal, while tribal elders offered traditional healing ceremonies alongside modern psychological support. Chief Eaglefeather's emergency council session revealed the complexity of their situation. Federal jurisdiction over reservation land provided some protection from corrupt local authorities, but it also complicated legitimate law enforcement response. The tribal police force consisted of only 12 officers covering territory the size of Connecticut, We'll protect them, Chief Feather declared with absolute conviction. These women are under tribal sovereignty now. Let Sheriff Bradley try to violate that. Seagal found unexpected comfort in the reservation's atmosphere of community and shared purpose. Children played traditional games while elders shared stories that connected present struggles to historical resistance. This was what he'd been seeking during his years on the road. Authentic human connection based on shared values rather than artificial fame. Frank felt Helen's presence strongest here, surrounded by the people. She'd served for 3 decades. The reservation school still displayed her photograph in the main hallway, with handwritten thank you notes from former students who'd become teachers, doctors, and tribal leaders themselves. But their moment of sanctuary was shattered by emergency radio broadcasts. Caldwell Brass had obtained federal warrants charging Frank and Seagal with kidnapping, murder, and terrorism based on fabricated evidence from the Ghost Mountain incident. Justice, it seemed, could be purchased along with everything else. Caldwell Brass arrived at his command post with the casual confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences for his actions. At 58, he possessed the distinguished appearance that money could buy. Silver hair styled expensively, custom suits that masked his predatory nature, and the cultured accent of inherited wealth combined with Ivy League education. His mobile command center occupied a ridge overlooking Pine Ridge Reservation, equipped with surveillance technology that would have impressed military commanders. 20 private security contractors provided muscle, former Special Forces operators, and mercenaries who asked no questions as long as their paychecks cleared. Gentlemen, Brass addressed his assembled forces with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. We have a containment situation. 6 witnesses who can testify about our transportation routes. 2 men who've seen too much and proven themselves capable of causing significant damage to our operations. The federal warrants represented the pinnacle of corruption, fabricated. Evidence processed through contacts in the U.S. Attorney's Office who owed their positions to Brass's political contributions. Murder charges based on the deaths of corrupt deputies. Kidnapping allegations stemming from the rescued women. Terrorism. Accusations tied to the destruction at Ghost Mountain. The beauty of the American legal system, Brass explained to Colonel Rourke, is that it responds to proper motivation. Federal judges who depend on campaign contributions. Prosecutors who understand which cases advance their careers. Justice is simply another commodity to be purchased at market rates. His wealth had built an empire that spanned legitimate mining operations and illegal trafficking networks. Native American reservations provided perfect cover, complex federal jurisdiction that slowed law enforcement response, poverty that made young women vulnerable to kidnapping, and isolated locations ideal for temporary holding facilities. Mr. Brass, Rourke reported through secure communications, tribal sovereignty is protecting them for now, but I can breach their defenses with minimal casualties to our forces. Brass studied surveillance footage of the reservation through high-powered telescopes. Children playing in dusty streets. Elders sitting in traditional councils. A community that represented everything he despised about America. People who valued dignity over profit, tradition over progress, justice over efficiency. Give them 24 hours to surrender Kowalski and Seagal, he decided. If they refuse, we'll obtain federal authorization for a full-scale raid. Sometimes you have to destroy a village to save it. His confidence was absolute. Money had never failed him before. Chief Feather's emergency tribal council convened in the traditional manner, with elders forming a circle beneath the sacred cottonwood that had witnessed decades of crucial decisions. The weight of community survival pressed down on weathered shoulders as they debated how to respond to Brass's ultimatum. Frank sat in respectful silence, understanding that his presence had brought danger to people who'd already suffered more than their share of injustice. Seagal studied the terrain around the council area, his tactical mind automatically cataloging defensive positions and escape routes. We don't abandon people who seek sanctuary, Chief Feather declared with quiet authority. That's not who we are. That's not who we've ever been. But as the council debated their options, Deputy Marcus Feather approached his uncle with shoulders bowed by shame and guilt. At 31, Marcus had always lived in the shadow of family expectations, struggling to prove himself worthy of the Feather name. Uncle, Marcus's voice cracked with emotion. I need to tell you something. The confession came in broken sentences punctuated by tears of genuine remorse. For months, Marcus had been providing information to Brass's organization in exchange for money to cover gambling debts that had spiraled beyond control. What started as simple reports about truck movements had enabled a human trafficking network that destroyed innocent lives. I thought I was just watching for drug runners. Marcus sobbed, his hands shaking as he revealed the scope of his betrayal. They said they needed to know about supply schedules, nothing more. I never knew about the girls. I swear on grandmother's grave, I never knew about the girls. Chief Eaglefeather's heartbreak was visible to everyone present. The nephew he'd raised after his brother's death, the young man he'd hoped would someday lead their people, had sold their security to criminals who trafficked in human misery. Your information compromised our defensive positions, Frank said quietly, understanding the tactical implications immediately. They know where we've placed the women, which buildings can be defended, how many officers we have. Marcus nodded miserably. They know everything. Guard rotations, weapon locations, even the school's layout where we're sheltering noncombatants. Radio intercepts confirmed their worst fears. Brass's mercenaries were already moving into positions based on intelligence Marcus had provided. The sanctuary had become a trap, with innocent tribal members now in the crossfire of a battle they'd never chosen. Dawn assault, Seagal announced grimly. They'll hit us when visibility favors their superior numbers and equipment. The betrayal cut deeper than enemy action because it came from within, poisoning the trust that held communities together. But there was no time for lengthy recriminations. Survival demanded immediate action. Dawn approached like an executioner's deadline, painting the eastern horizon with shades of amber that promised bloodshed with the sunrise. Seagal stood among the ancient petroglyphs of the sacred ceremonial grounds, studying terrain that would soon become a battlefield. We make our stand here, he announced to the assembled defenders. The sacred site offered natural advantages, elevated position, limited approach routes, and spiritual significance that would inspire their fighters while demoralizing attackers who understood they were violating holy ground. Chief Eaglefeather revealed a crucial asset. Several elderly tribal members were Korean War and Vietnam veterans who still remembered how to fight. These old warriors might move slowly, but their minds remained sharp with tactical knowledge earned through blood and sacrifice. Frank took command of organizing these grizzled defenders, recognizing kindred spirits in their weathered faces. Tommy, Crow Feather, 74, had fought Chinese divisions at Chosin Reservoir. Jimmy Standing Bear, 69, survived 3 tours in Vietnam's deadliest AOs. These men understood that age and treachery could overcome youth and strength. We're not trying to win a conventional battle, Frank explained as they prepared defensive positions. We're buying time for the women and children to reach safety while making these bastards pay for every inch of ground. Maria coordinated the evacuation of noncombatants to the reservation school, the most defensible building with thick walls and limited entrances. Children and elders would shelter there while warriors prepared to die, protecting them if necessary. Seagal began transforming the ceremonial grounds into a killing field, using his knowledge of tactics and the terrain's natural advantages. Ancient stone formations provided cover for snipers. Sacred fire pits became obstacles that would channel attackers into predetermined kill zones. Every boulder and depression offered tactical opportunity to those who understood warfare's geometry. The irony wasn't lost on him. Using a place of peace and spiritual reflection as the stage for necessary violence. But sometimes sacred ground had to be defended with blood, and the ancestors who'd carved these petroglyphs would understand the choice. Radio chatter revealed Brass's forces finalizing their assault plan. 40 armed mercenaries against 12 reservation defenders and 3 unexpected allies. The mathematics of survival looked grim, but mathematics had never accounted for the fighting spirit of warriors defending their homes. Let them come, Seagal whispered to the ancient stones. This ground has seen battles before. In the hour before dawn, Seagal became a ghost among the shadows, moving through Brass's perimeter with the silent precision of a predator who'd spent decades perfecting the art of controlled violence. The mercenaries had positioned themselves with military competence, But they were preparing for conventional assault against a conventional enemy. Steven Seagal was anything but conventional. The first sentry died without a sound, Seagal's knife, finding the precise spot between vertebrae that severed the spinal cord instantly. The body was dragged into concealment before rigor mortis could set in, leaving no trace of the kill except one less guard on Brass's tactical display. Traditional weapons provided by tribal elders served purposes that modern equipment couldn't match. A war club crafted from sacred oak crushed the skull of a mercenary who'd positioned himself too far from his squad. A bone knife, blessed by medicine men generations dead, opened the throat of another sentry who thought darkness provided safety. Each kill was silent, invisible to thermal imaging and radio networks that depended on regular check-ins. Seagal moved like wind through tall grass, striking without warning and vanishing before his presence could be detected. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical elimination. Mercenaries began to understand they were being hunted by something beyond their experience. Frank and his elderly veterans prepared their own deadly surprises, using knowledge gained in jungles half a world away. Improvised explosive devices crafted from mining equipment and farming supplies. Punji stakes sharpened to lethal points and concealed along likely approach routes. Trip wires connected to shotgun shells that would remove legs at the knee. Tommy Crow feather positioned himself in the bell tower of the old church, his Korean War vintage M1 Garand loaded with hand-loaded ammunition that would punch through body armor at 800 yards. Jimmy Standing Bear distributed homemade explosives that could channel attackers into predetermined kill zones. Just like the old days, Frank muttered as he armed the last improvised mine. Except this time we're fighting for something that actually matters. As the first light of dawn broke over the desert, Colonel Rourke discovered that 8 of his perimeter guards had vanished without a trace. His radio networks reported increasing paranoia among the remaining mercenaries, who understood they were facing an opponent capable of picking them off one by one. "Sir," Rourke's voice carried new respect as he radioed Brass, "we're dealing with a professional. I recommend immediate assault before he eliminates more of our force." Dawn had arrived, and the real battle was about to begin. The main assault began with military precision as 20 mercenaries advanced on the ceremonial grounds while another squad moved toward the school where civilians sheltered. Colonel Rourke had expected token resistance from reservation police, but the withering fire that greeted his forces spoke of professional military opposition that Frank's elderly veterans fought with the cunning wisdom of soldiers who'd survived wars that killed. Stronger, faster men. They used knowledge accumulated over decades of combat, turning age and experience into weapons more deadly than youth and strength. Tommy Crowfeather's first shot from the church bell tower dropped a mercenary at 600 yards, the heavy .30-06 round punching through body armor like tissue paper. His follow-up shots forced the assault team into cover, disrupting their planned advance and giving the defensive positions time to engage. Jimmy Standing Bear's improvised explosives channeled attackers exactly where Frank had predicted. When mercenaries sought cover behind seemingly innocent rock formations, buried mining charges detonated with devastating effect. Shrapnel from dynamite and steel fragments turned natural cover into killing zones. Frank himself anchored the defensive line with his .45, placing each shot with the deliberate precision of someone who'd learned marksmanship when ammunition was precious and every round had to count. His position behind the sacred fire pit provided cover while allowing clear fields of fire across the ceremonial ground's natural approaches. The mercenaries found themselves fighting an enemy who refused to follow conventional tactical doctrine. These old warriors used dirty tricks learned in forgotten conflicts, concealed spider holes that allowed flanking fire, camouflage positions that appeared empty until muzzle flashes revealed deadly occupants, retreat routes that led attackers into carefully prepared ambushes. "What the hell are we fighting?" One mercenary radioed Rourke as his squad took casualties from opponents he couldn't even see. Maria coordinated the school's defense with tribal police officers who understood they were protecting everything that mattered to their people. The thick walls absorbed assault rifle fire while defenders returned precise shots through carefully prepared firing ports. But the defensive success came at a cost. Frank took shrapnel from a grenade blast, blood streaming down his left arm as he continued firing. Tommy Crow Feather's position in the bell tower drew concentrated fire that eventually forced him to abandon his sniper's nest. The sound of approaching helicopters suggested Brass was escalating with air support, transforming a ground battle into something approaching a military operation. Colonel Rourke's patience finally snapped as his professionally trained mercenaries continued taking casualties from elderly defenders who should have been overwhelmed. In the first minutes of assault, abandoning tactical command, he decided to personally eliminate Steven Seagal in single combat among the sacred petroglyphs at a T-45. Rourke possessed the physical advantages of youth, superior equipment, and modern military training. His body armor could stop small arms fire. His tactical gear included night vision and communications equipment, and his combat knife had ended lives on 3 continents. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a personal fight. Seagal met him in the center of the ceremonial ground, surrounded by ancient stone carvings that had witnessed countless struggles between good and evil. The two warriors circled each other like predators, each seeking the opening that would end the fight decisively. Rourke attacked with military combatives, efficient, brutal techniques designed to kill quickly and move on to the next target. His knife work was professional, his grappling holds properly applied, his strikes aimed at vital organs with surgical precision. But Seagal fought with something deeper than technique. Aikido flowed through his movements like water finding its natural course, redirecting Rourke's aggression into empty air while building momentum for devastating counterattacks. Each defensive move created opportunities for offense, turning the colonel's strength against him. The battle ranged across the sacred ground, both men using ancient stones as weapons and shields. Rourke's combat knife drew first blood, opening a gash across Seagal's left shoulder that sent crimson streaming down his flannel shirt. The wound would have ended most fights, but Seagal fought with the spiritual strength of someone defending the innocent. "You should have stayed in Hollywood." Rourke snarled as he pressed his advantage, believing victory was within reach. Seagal's response came not in words, but in action. A classic Aikido technique caught Rourke's knife hand, applying leverage that snapped bone audibly. The follow-up strike found the precise nerve cluster that paralyzed the colonel's left arm. Instantly, the final moment came as Rourke, desperate and wounded, attempted a last-ditch tackle that left him vulnerable to Seagal's most lethal technique. Hands that had spent 50 years perfecting the art of controlled violence found the exact pressure point that severed Rourke's connection between brain and body. The colonel collapsed among the petroglyphs, his neck broken with clinical precision. But radio chatter revealed the fight was far from over. Viper McReady was approaching with stolen military explosives, intent on personal revenge that would destroy everything sacred about this ground. Viper McReady's return was announced by the roar of his Harley-Davidson as he burst through the perimeter with explosive devices strapped to his leather cut like a suicide bomber. His face bore fresh bandages from their first encounter at Dusty's truck stop, but hatred had transformed his injuries into fuel for obsession. Seagal. Viper's scream echoed across the ceremonial grounds as he dismounted, pulling military-grade C4 from a stolen National Guard armory. "Time to finish what we started, you ponytailed freak." The biker had abandoned all tactical sense in favor of personal revenge. He wired explosives to ancient petroglyphs with the casual disregard of someone willing to destroy sacred history. For momentary satisfaction, his plan was simple: eliminate Seagal and everyone else in a fireball that would erase this humiliation forever. Seagal approached through the smoke and dust of battle, his movements carrying the fluid grace that had made him legendary. Blood from his shoulder wound painted his flannel shirt crimson, but his dark eyes held the calm certainty of someone who'd found his true purpose. "You should have stayed down," Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying across the ceremonial ground. Like a judgment, the Viper's response was a wild swing with a crowbar scavenged from his motorcycle's toolkit. The blow would have crushed a normal man's skull, but Seagal moved like water around stone, redirecting the biker's momentum while building his own devastating counterattack. The final battle took place among the ancient symbols carved by hands that had defended this ground for generations. Viper fought with savage desperation, using explosives as weapons and showing no regard for collateral damage that would kill innocent tribal members. But Seagal was fighting for something larger than personal survival. His aikido became an expression of spiritual warfare, good triumphing over evil through technique perfected over decades of disciplined study. Each movement flowed from the last, building toward an inevitable conclusion. The end came with devastating finality. Seagal's ultimate technique caught Viper in mid-charge, using the biker's own violence to fuel a throw that sent him crashing face-first into the asphalt parking area with bone-crushing force. Viper's face scraped across gravel and pavement, literally eating asphalt as the story's title had promised. As Viper lay unconscious, the sound of approaching sirens indicated new arrivals, but whether friend or foe remained to be determined. The sirens belonged to legitimate federal agents, FBI specialists in human trafficking cases led by Special Agent Karen Winters, a 42-year-old veteran investigator whose career had been built on dismantling criminal networks that preyed on the vulnerable. Her tactical team surrounded the ceremonial grounds with professional efficiency that contrasted sharply with the corrupt deputies' earlier bungling. Federal agents. Ceasefire. Winters commanded as she surveyed the battlefield littered with Brass's defeated mercenaries and unconscious bikers. Caldwell Brass attempted to assert his fabricated authority, producing federal warrants and making imperious demands for immediate arrests. His cultured voice carried the entitlement of someone who'd never faced consequences for his actions, confident that money and connections would protect him as they always had. Agent Winters. These men are wanted terrorists who've destroyed federal property and murdered law enforcement officers, Brass declared with the authority of someone accustomed to being believed. But Seagal had been recording everything through equipment salvaged from his truck, capturing hours of incriminating conversations that revealed the true scope of the criminal conspiracy. Maria's weeks of undercover surveillance provided additional evidence that painted a complete picture of the trafficking network. Most damning were the testimonies of the 6 rescued women, who could identify their captors and describe the systematic cruelty they'd endured. Their courage in speaking truth to power represented the kind of witness testimony that destroyed criminal empires. Mr. Brass, Agent Winters said as she reviewed the evidence on Seagal's recording device, "You're under arrest for human trafficking, conspiracy, murder, and about 40 other federal charges that should keep you in prison for the rest of your natural life." Brass's confidence finally wavered as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He made frantic phone calls to Washington contacts, demanding immediate intervention from political allies who owed their positions to his campaign contributions. "You have no idea how deep this goes," he threatened as agents led him toward their vehicles. "I'll be out in 48 hours. I own half the federal judiciary." But his political connections had limits, and trafficking in human beings crossed lines that even corrupt officials couldn't ignore. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and the media attention would make this case impossible to bury. Sheriff Bradley and his corrupt deputies faced their own federal charges, their criminal network exposed by the very violence they'd used to protect it. Justice, it seemed, could still triumph when honest law enforcement officers had sufficient evidence to act. Marcus Eaglefeather's revelation stunned everyone present as he stepped forward with evidence that transformed the entire narrative. For the past month, he'd been working undercover for the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force, his apparent betrayal actually part of an elaborate sting operation designed to gather evidence against the entire criminal network. "I've been feeding them false information for weeks," Marcus explained to his uncle's shocked expression. "The gambling debts, the corruption, all of it was cover for the investigation. Agent Winters recruited me after the second girl disappeared." His apparent cooperation with Brass's organization had allowed him to document the complete financial network that funded the trafficking operation. Bank records, wire transfers, and recorded conversations that would convict everyone from street-level bikers to corrupt federal officials who'd provided political protection. "We needed someone inside the network who could move freely without suspicion," Agent Winters confirmed. Marcus volunteered for an assignment that could have gotten him killed if his cover was blown. The emotional cost of the deception was written across Marcus's face as he faced his uncle's mixture of relief and residual hurt. Maintaining his cover had required him to appear corrupt while watching innocent women suffer, to seem disloyal while actually risking everything to protect his people. Chief Eaglefeather's forgiveness came in the traditional manner, a ceremony that acknowledged both the pain of deception and the courage required for redemption. The tribal council witnessed Marcus's restoration to honor, understanding that sometimes duty required terrible sacrifices. "You carried this burden alone to protect all of us," the chief said as he placed his hands on his nephew's shoulders. That took a different kind of courage, but courage nonetheless. The federal raid that followed swept up corrupt officials across 3 states, dismantling a trafficking network that had operated for years with impunity. Death's Head MC members faced federal racketeering charges, while Brass's business associates discovered that association with human traffickers carried serious legal consequences. Marcus began the long process of rebuilding trust within his community, accepting that redemption was earned through daily actions rather than single moments of confession. His uncle's faith provided foundation, but respect had to be rebuilt, one honest decision at a time. The tribal council officially commended his service while acknowledging the complex emotions his deception had created. Forgiveness was possible, but healing would take time, a lesson that applied to both personal relationships and community recovery from trauma. 1 week later, Pine Ridge Reservation had begun the healing process that follows trauma survived and justice served. The 6 rescued women received comprehensive support from tribal social services, federal victim assistance programs, and traditional healing ceremonies that addressed spiritual wounds alongside psychological damage. Frank Kowalski found himself embraced by a community that recognized his sacrifice and honored his wife's memory. The tribal council offered him honorary membership and a small house near the reservation school, where Helen's photograph still held a place of honor in the main hallway. "Helen always said this was sacred ground," Frank told Chief Eaglefeather, as they walked past the school playground where children played with the carefree joy of innocence protected from evil. "I think she'd want me to stay, to continue the work she started." His decision surprised no one who'd witnessed his courage during the crisis. Frank's army pension would fund expanded supply operations, while his military experience would strengthen the reservation's security planning. Most importantly, his presence would ensure that Helen's educational legacy continued through someone who understood her vision. Maria Clearwater received promotion to head of reservation security, with expanded authority and resources to combat human trafficking throughout the region. Her courage during the investigation earned recognition from federal agencies that would provide ongoing support for tribal law enforcement. Marcus Eaglefeather began the slow process of rebuilding trust, while training other officers in anti-trafficking techniques. His undercover experience provided valuable knowledge about criminal networks, but his real redemption would come through years of honest service to his community. Steven Seagal prepared to return to the highway, but not unchanged by his experience. The tribe honored him with a traditional naming ceremony, calling him Silent Thunder for his deadly efficiency in protecting the innocent. Chief Eaglefeather presented him with a sacred eagle feather and turquoise necklace, symbols of the spiritual warrior's path he now walked. As Seagal climbed into his repaired Peterbilt, the CB radio crackled with reports of trouble in Colorado, where truckers were being harassed by corrupt officials. Frank walked over to shake hands goodbye, both men understanding that their partnership had changed them forever. "Sounds like somebody out there could use the help of a certain long-haul trucker," Frank observed with a slight smile. Seagal fired up the diesel engine, its rumble carrying the promise of justice delivered wherever the road might lead. "The road's calling, Frank. Take care of yourself." The truck pulled onto the highway as the sun rose over the desert, heading toward whatever injustice awaited correction. Frank stood watching until the Peterbilt disappeared into the distance, both men having found redemption through service to others and the courage to stand up for what's right. If you like the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.